We'll end up with a true climate change. So there don't know the real context. So actually, this is the language has a word which is basically a system of virtual machines which tries to be really efficient in relation to transactions of loans.
Yeah, they are using it over there, but it seems that it's not enough. They're not coming. So I think with the richer quarter of money, choice, and the technology, math-based currency, and the P2P lending using Bitcoin, just give me the opportunity to introduce Richard Porter. He's an empirical economist and the CEO of Coxfield Digital Coin Lab. And one of the other characteristics of him is that he's 43 years veteran of two different Feds, the Fed Board and the Fed of Chicago. So a long experience that now has been applied to this new world. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you.
So I think money has always been a work in progress. It continues to be. I want to mention something. I've done a lot of work on the use of hundreds inside and outside the U.S. and everything Professor Campbell said about that wasn't right, because most of them are outside the U.S. They're a store of wealth. They're in places like Argentina and Russia. It's not tax evasion in the U.S. They're actually used in the U.S. as a form of savings by a lot of immigrants who really aren't banked, even if they could be banked. And there are better, these have been useful. They're a better store of wealth. Gold might be a better one, but to keep. I have a piece of gold that one of my ancestors brought back from San Francisco from the gold rush, and it's a little thing that's on a high tip. And I'll give it to one of my grandsons one of these days if I can remember where it is. Recently, there's been a gold rush. You know, a gold rush must be when it's easy to get the gold, so people rush to get it, because usually it's hard to get gold. And we've seen that in Bitcoin too, obviously. And Bitcoin is interesting because it's scarce and it's digital. Money is becoming digital. We had a big problem at the Fed with the check system. It was expensive to move them all around, took a lot of energy, trucks, planes, specialized couriers, complicated sorting machines, and everybody wanted the original check in their mail at the end of the month. And that was a very expensive thing to do because Congress wanted us to give them back quickly. So 1 or 2 days. And there was no easy way to do it until we got this idea of a substitute check, which was just a digital image of a check. And so instead of moving paper around, we started moving images around, much cheaper to do. We saved billions of dollars. The question is, can we do that more broadly in currency like Bitcoin? And this guy, J. Orland Grave, who was a Harvard-trained economist, was at Wharton, started writing about this subject back in the 90s, and there's lots of nice pieces about him. He died just before Bitcoin got created, but there's this definition of what digital cash is, which I like, and it's simple. Here's the first big thing got really interested to me with Bitcoin was the Cyprus island tax, which occurred in March of 2013 when the euro said to depositors in Cyprus, we're going to fix the problems with the banks in Cyprus by taking away your deposits and recapitalizing the banks. And in fact, they initially proposed to do that with any deposit, a regular one, not a large one necessarily. And that got people, the line says, no need for guns, just tell them you're from the EU. And all of a sudden, the thing on the right there are the Google estimates of interest in Bitcoin. For a few countries, you can't read that, and I can't either. Argentina, China, Cyprus, and Russia. Those are obviously the Cypriots and the Russians are connected here because there are a lot of Russian money in Cyprus. Any rate, so here's a list of some of the issues with banking that's in the news and which some people in the Bitcoin world think is important. We still use, everybody's talking about cash is still king. 85% of the world is still using cash for household expenditures. Cross-border payments are expensive. Email is cheap. Why can't cross-border payments be cheaper? Big banks continue to do things that aren't so good. They play by their own set of rules. Chase alone has spent $25 billion in the last several years trying to become square with the government. It's not clear what's going on. Banks fail to promote. They do price fixing at foreign exchange, the gold market. They don't follow their AML policies, the anti-money laundering, or send money where they're not supposed to because they can make money. Chase forgot to figure out that Madoff was a crook. Cybersecurity has been a big problem. Bank card fraud is much too pervasive. And banks, this is sort of a similar discussion we had yesterday. Banks are using old style systems that many of them were designed a long time ago. They don't upgrade very well. And we have all kinds of things that do the same things, but they're different, like bank wires and ACHs are move money around electronically, but there are sort of two different networks. And finally, in the US, we're really backwards. We have chip and pin, but we're going to not use the pin. That's safer, yeah. So Bitcoin, it was thought, could solve a lot of these problems. And there's some quotes from Satoshi. You can read them. I have a cold and my voice will give out, so I'm going to let you read a little bit. So one of the things that's interesting about Bitcoin is that it allows us to start thinking fresh about what how we should regard money, whether money should be a nation state thing or something else, a private thing, even maybe a local thing. And those are two statements. The first one, I think I agree with, is reasonable. The nation state helped make coins legitimate, and they can perform a function there. The second statement is just sort of a silly statement. Both these statements were in some Forbes article. And you know, as we've seen, and as David was talking yesterday about Fed coin, maybe a Bitcoin-like material can do one as well. And number two is just dead wrong. I'm not going to go here. Let's skip that. You all know most of this material. The one line is there's no center in Bitcoin in some sense, and that makes it hard to attack by the government. If I give a talk like this to economists, they'll say, well, it's easy for the government to somehow take down Bitcoin, and that's the end of the story if you don't like what Bitcoin is. But I don't think that's true. There's no center. How can you sort of take down open source? It's difficult. And Bitcoin is, since it's not state money, it's something that is new and sort of answers questions that several people, some of whom are probably monetary quacks, but some of whom aren't, have thought about money over the years. I wanted the list of this book talks that would be 2 or 3 pages, but David Chum is one of the guys who worked on Eat Money Early. Fisher Black, everybody knows. Jane Jacobs, how many people know who Jane Jacobs is? Only one? Jane Jacobs actually is Bob Lucas's favorite non-economist economist. And she wrote the stuff about fixed windows in neighborhoods and you'll have less crime, stuff like that. And she was aghast at the fact that cities couldn't have their own money. So, you know, Detroit sits there and they can't adjust their terms of trade with the rest of the world, Singapore and Hong Kong can. So Boyle is really talking about the fact that everybody views money as a nation state thing. First, as Andreas said earlier, that's not true. That hasn't always been a nation state thing. It has been recently, but before that it wasn't. And maybe it should be again. That's the question. Here's a nice quote on that. It's only been the last 200 years that we really viewed money the way we now view it. Anyway, so if we are going to go and not have national currencies, what could we do? One thing is we could have local currencies, like I said with Jane Jacobs. Another thing we could do is we could have a currency for a country, a private currency for a country like Iceland, which actually did an experiment with this called Aurora coin, where there were coins that were given to people on Iceland by being a resident. And on one day in February, they gave everybody that many coins. And given Iceland has a pretty crummy inflation record, it's up there over 80% in the mid 80s, whereas the US was down, it's down when one of the worst times, 10, 11, 12%. But anyway, Iceland has this somewhat checkered economic history, and the same thing occurred after the crisis when Iceland sort of went away. And Holland and England had to bail out the and I don't think Iceland has paid anybody back yet for all that. Have they, Wilco? At any rate, so this person came along and said, we're going to give you these new tokens, why don't you use them, and you'll be better off. So they had a choice. And the tokens could be mined before the residents were given them. And before the price went way up to $96 or $97 a token with a huge market cap. And then in the end, people got their tokens, and it was sort of a Gresham's law thing. They didn't think they'd necessarily be around that much longer, so they spent them, and the price fell very quickly. So the thing didn't work at all. It could have, but it didn't. So comparing Bitcoin and Aurora coin, it looks like Bitcoin is a better bet because it's universal, it's been around longer, and you get the expression loss effect operating. And Metcalfe's law, which has to do with the size of your market, the network size. So the other end of the spectrum, one could imagine Bitcoin or any other sort of worldwide currency. We had that sort of in the 19th century. In the 19th century, international trade became much more integrated. And then in the 20th century, that's sort of when we went in the opposite direction. And so another issue here that this brings up, changing the sort of the paradigm we've been having with the national currencies, is we could have competition in currencies, private or public, Fed coin or something else. And Frederick Hayek, near the end of his life, wrote an interesting essay about the denationalization of currencies. He suggested that we would be better off if we had competition in currency provision. And at the same time, we can also have currencies like free coin, which if you don't use it, you lose some of it. And so there's an incentive to use it, and you don't have the problem of what's going to happen at the zero bound, where we have to engage in all these non-standard monetary procedures to try to get the economy going again, something that may not end up that well. So money is a social institution. So we can think about having money for just everybody to have their own money, as Andreas was saying this morning. It's a possibility, but it doesn't make much sense since money is a social institution. And the bigger the network, the more likely the thing is going to work. So we're going to probably be stuck with having some regulation of some money. And Bitcoin, people want to regulate Bitcoin and are trying to regulate Bitcoin, but most of them don't know how to do it because they're thinking of the past kinds of currencies. It's not clear what makes the most sense, given this is as new as it is. It seems to me it's a little bit like when autos were introduced around the turn of the 20th century. People didn't know how to regulate them. They thought they would scare the horses. So you had to, in England, they passed laws saying you needed 2 or 3 people with flags going in front of your car so everything would work out. I mean, the tendency to just look at things the way they were in the past. Anyway, here's one of the interesting things I think about Bitcoin that hasn't been mentioned, and that is you don't necessarily need force to protect it. And I've done a lot of work on currency in use of the dollar outside the US, and a guy who had direct experience with this in Africa, who knew how hundreds saved his family's wealth, told me, Dr. Porter, you really got to get a list of who's got the guns, and who's got the money, and if you correlate that, then you'll understand what's really going on. Well, that's pretty hard to do, but it's true that there is a connection between the two. And if you look at the last point on here, Silk Road, everybody's upset about Silk Road, and it may well be upsetting. Somebody did a nice analysis of what was done on this eBay-like thing, and most of it was drugs, not all, but almost all of it was drugs. But probably the cases they listed there, nobody got hurt in this transaction. So, whereas if you buy drugs directly, which I don't have much of any experience of myself, but if you do it directly in many places, you can get hurt. So I want to talk, this is almost changing gears, but this is a little slide to show traditional money evolves very slowly. Now, it evolves very slowly because maybe it's not a big thing the US dollar doesn't have that much of a counterfeiting problem. We introduced a new size dollar in 29, in 89 the North Koreans supposedly developed a super note that used about the same technology that we did. In fact, people didn't realize what it was for a while. And so we introduced the security thread, which they and others eventually copied. And then in 96, we did a much bigger thing and introduced a bigger head using the fact that humans can recognize faces. We've got 50 muscles and whatnot to recognize faces. So, you know, if you go outside your local tribal circle, you'll know who the enemy is, and we've been exploiting that. So bigger heads, and then in 2013, we came out with a very fancy security ribbon. So it's here in 1991, here 2013, we really have responded to that, to the 1989, we took us that many years to respond to the threat, and we did, but we even did that slowly. Here's a sort of quick list of some of the highlights of what's happening to Bitcoin. And look at the last thing at the bottom, which is how long it took us to, in the 6 years that Bitcoin's been around, it took that long to get this new 100 out. We said we'd get it out. The idea was out there in about 2007. I had a meeting at the Chicago Fed where we're passing around the new note maybe in 2010, showing people what it was, but it took 3 more years to get it out because there turned to be a little crease in the notes, and it took 3 years to figure out how to manufacture it properly without the crease. So it's fairly slow. And here's sort of why it is slow. One's top down, one's bottom up. One interesting thing is the Bitcoin side is transparent. Everything's in the open source. The currency is not open source. There are hidden tags in the currency, pieces of things that the Fed doesn't tell anybody about because they want something to say this is a legitimate piece of currency. That isn't. There's been proposals to start having some stuff that the private sector could know about, not the counterfeiters, but some people in the private sector that's never gotten out there. Now the risks, obviously Bitcoin, we're all aware of the risks they've had with on exchanges, Mt. Gox, and the more recent ones. The dollar faces a risk. It's a risk that it's not going to be the world's reserve currency. And I think it's conceivable today it wouldn't be, the dollar wouldn't be the reserve currency if it weren't for Paul Volcker. Because we had a pretty pretty big increase in inflation over the 60s into the 70s. And Volcker was the first person to say no more and reverse what had taken, what was, people began to think was just the way we were going to operate. He probably saved the dollar and made money much less of a political fund. The final thing on the left side is the costs of running currency in the U.S. are not cheap. That $100 billion estimate, there's actually one that's double that. And you take tax evasion, which I'm not sure those estimates they make that much sense, but this $100 billion estimate takes account of all the world resources, guarding the currency, moving it around, so forth and so on for all the notes. It's not necessarily so cheap to do. Let me mention Bitcoin and Ripple a little bit. I think Ripple is an interesting alternative. It's a little more, it's easier for somebody in the world to talk to people. I've talked to the CEO of Ripple. It's a little more of a top-down structure in place. And they seem to be willing to work with the existing power structure more directly than Bitcoin, which is just more on the fringe in some ways. But Bitcoin, obviously, as people have continued to say in this conference, Bitcoin does look like it's got some stuff that will, outside of currency and inside of currency, that will hit on a lot of fronts. Bitcoin costs where am I? Going all up. The Bitcoin, the transaction cost of Bitcoin, I don't think you can read that, but the average transaction costs today are something about $6.50. This is the mining cost. That's not a trivial number by any means. And Ripple, with its different consensus mechanism, is probably cheaper. It may not be as powerful, but it's cheaper. But Satoshi basically said that's okay. That's what gold mining is all about, and Bitcoin is like that. This is the price you pay to get something that's going to be appropriately scarce. There's no free lunch in getting your scarcity or something. So I've been anticipating this point before. Hayek thought this was a good idea. Stan Fisher, who's the vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, made an exceptional analysis and critique of Hayek at the time, saying, well, I don't believe this is really going to work because banks can always take the money and run and cheat, and there's no guarantee, there's nothing that's going to guarantee the competition will work. Hayek basically thought you could have competition, and people, the currency provider that gave the most stable purchasing power would sort of win out and get more adherence. And Fisher said, well, might probably wouldn't happen because of cheating of one sort or another, but the way Bitcoin can overcome that. So this is, it seems to me, a nice opportunity if over some long period of time to see whether or not Hayek was right. Here's a nice quote from Hayek saying, we've got three great inventions of mankind: language, law, and money. And we've taken this great idea of money, it's evolved, and we've gone off the road with it. So this is, or in this, the new things really are things that through markets and through sort of spontaneous order, we can get something better. Any rate, as you see, I think these currencies are, and the competition is going to be interesting. I don't think it's easy to predict anything about the future, how fast these things will go. Payment changes don't really happen fast unless something big is happening to the mechanism. So if interest rates are very high, velocity changes. Got 1 minute left, okay. Let me mention, here's my idea of putting everybody on the same, say, watch, where you get two-factor authentication. You can do Bitcoin, you can do anything else. You can even do flight. They've covered sort of the globe, although in places that you'd hope they'd have some, like Africa, they don't. They have basically a very simple scheme. The individual puts down there what they want, what they think the loan should be. They get scored. People look at their history, and then they get financed or not. The interesting thing is these guys are willing to finance a very small part of what the borrower wants, and sometimes these loans are of only a 2-week or even maybe less duration. At any rate, they've done 38,000 of them, almost 13,000 different loans. I said about the flexibility, the size compared to Prosper's are about one-tenth. And there's a time series, total loans and monthly total.
Thank you very much. We have now questions.
I think I like your story a lot. But one question about Bitcoin compared to, let's say, the dollar. And because of this fixed supply of the Bitcoin, this fixed rule, you have these deflationary tendencies, or other way around, you have enormous volatility in the exchange rate. Is that not an enormous problem going forward, that this sort of inherent instability of the exchange rate of Bitcoin because of this fixed supply rule, would that not be in the end the biggest problem?
Well, the supply function is very fixed in the short run. And that over the next 20 years or so, Bitcoin, I think, is growing at
very small money.
Well, it was a 2% quantity increase from, I don't know, 2013 to 2040 something. I don't remember the exact calculation. So it's sort of about at the price level. It's not ridiculous. Obviously, at some point it's nothing. I mean, the next century is nothing virtually. But if that's really the sticking point, you have things like free coin, where you have this brokerage fee that if you don't use it, you're going to have less of it. So if you're in a situation where prices are falling, you still may have more than if prices are falling in the normal situation. People hold on to their money because they're going to be able to get more next year than they can get today. But in this situation, that wouldn't be the case. You have an incentive to spend.
Good morning, Howard from the European Commission. So I also like this a lot because I like to read and study theory of money for quite a while. I've read Hayek as well. I wonder if you would put maybe Kiyotaki Wright, this kind of literature search theory approach to money, maybe as another read on the reading list as well. And in a way, for myself, I've come to the conclusion that as long as you talk about money, I mean, to me, it is commodity. And here, I just looked on Wikipedia. In Germany and Austria alone, there are about 60 regional monies.
Right.
That perform this function of a commodity, that people attach additional functions to it. They restrict its use regionally because they want it to be spent only in a particular region. They apply some of the Keynesian proposals that the money loses value after a while, and you can revalidate it to keep the value. So I mean, all this exists, but basically it's a commodity. But in the beginning of the talk, you mentioned this chain. You mentioned this thing about the terms of trade of a city, and I think that this is where the problem starts, and where Hayek debate transcends to something non-money, and where the money becomes closer to credit, and where I get into different sort of problems, and Cyprus and balance of payments, net international investment positions. What is your view on that? Where does money stop being money and where it's actually credit? Although I'm still talking about foreign exchange, I'm talking for one money against the other, but actually the problem I'm analyzing is a problem of credit, where I threaten another party by changing the value of my money, and the party has claims on me denominated in that money. Actually, it's a problem of credit. And is there not a lot of confusion in the literature on money by not distinguishing the commodity aspects of money and not really of different forms of credits that are sometimes very close substitutes to money, where actually the problem, the economic problem behind this problem for
When your first part of your question, you said something about my reference to, I just didn't hear what you said. We can talk privately.
It was just a question if you would put
No, Kiyotaki is right, that's fine.
Yeah.
For sure, no problem.
Thank you. I completely agree with you from the European Union, Harold, right? And I'm also also very interested in monetary theory, and we're also working on the next generation currency. My question would be, all the currencies and altcoins we know are basically scarce and limited. And what is your opinion on money becoming abundant? Not limiting money at all.
I mean, you know, you go to the Orient and they print up this money, and when somebody dies, that's free. They burn it. It's a ritual. It has some religious significance. I mean, money is a token that is going to have value. It's got to be scarce in some fashion, or doesn't. It's not going to have. If it's free, it's not. People are. I mean, it's like Monopoly money. My sisters and brother used to play a game where we sort of had this game where we sort of jacked up the money supply during the game. Prices went up, and we all felt happy. It was a good thing, but it was money illusion. That's all it was. It was fun. People like to think that you're getting something more.
The last question.
What do you view was the failure of the Icelandic experiment, Aurora coin? Did the government issue this currency?
No. This was entirely private. The government, I'm not sure. They said things that were probably negative, but they didn't try to interfere with the process at all. There were 3 successive drops. The price went way up before the first drop. Then there were 2 more. I don't know. It's still out there. It's maybe on the last time I looked, it was like 100 lists. So they're up about 500. It was still alive, but it wasn't being used in a very significant way.
So thank you very much. Presenter, Raffaele Mauro from Intesa Sanpaolo, presenting a paper on crypto commons and crypto equity, shared resources, and on the blockchain. You have 15 minutes.
So, thank you for.
Hello? Okay. Thank you for inviting us.
Sorry, here is the full screen button.
Okay, in the meantime, thank you for inviting us. I'm presenting a research that I started with Primavera PDP. Primavera was unable to be here, but she's an amazing academic. She's now based at the Berkman Center for Internet Society at Harvard University, and I advise you to look at her articles and watch her talks on YouTube. I'm Raffaele Mauro. I was working previously mainly in the venture capital industry, and I also advocated the open and free internet with the hacking cultural associations such as Programmings. And I did my PhD at Bocconi and master at Harvard. And there I met Primavera. What we're trying to do? Basically, we are trying to structure ideas around the concept of crypto equity, crypto commons, and crypto equity crowdfunding. We have more questions than answers. This is a preliminary work, and we just want to brainstorm ideas and collect inputs from you. So basically, we started our line of research crossing the lines between the Kennedy School of Government and the Development Center, and we started working on the general wave of 2.0. Sorry, just move right.
PDF in German. Just move to the right and control up.
Oh, thank you. Control L. Control L.
Yes.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, it's good.
So, as I was saying, we are just trying to brainstorm ideas and collect it. So, what is crypto equity? Crypto equity could have it's a very confusing concept. There are several technical implementations and several potential definitions. One potential definition is to have secure and tradable tokens on a distributed network, or to be more specific, having equity stakes with blockchain technology. Okay. As I said, there are many different potential ideas on how to structure this concept, and there are huge challenges in terms of regulation. There are several ways to categorize crypto equity. There is a very interesting post on the Sword blog on Medium with a six-fold categorization. We identified 4 main clusters. 2 are strong, so the most important one is just to have shares on a project like equity stakes. The second one is to have something like tokens, which represents ownership. And there are also weaker forms, so having tokens that gives you access to products or to immaterial networks such as membership and access prior privileges. We already talked in the previous speeches about this topic, but I just will go fast on the building blocks. The first building block is the public ledger. So blockchain technology is based on a decentralized network of communicating nodes, peer-to-peer, and this is one of the strongest elements of the resilience of the system. Then we have the blockchain, so the transactions are blocks. The blocks are connected linearly, and I will not go in depth that, but there was a huge technological discontinuity that provided resilience, stability, and trustless decentralized systems. Third building block, and now we are entering in a more abstract space, is the concept of smart contract. Nowadays, there was in the last couple of years, the idea is older, but in the last couple of years, there was a huge escalation of the contracts. So I will use that people to